encapsulates the understanding of the economy by folks who have never run a business or tried to turn a profit. The liberal notion is that business owners are immune to basic economics and their hiring decisions are entirely unaffected by tax rates.
Excuse me, the senator's time has expired.
I ask unanimous consent to be able to go for just a few minutes more.
Without objection.
With this view in mind, it is not hard to imagine proposals for taxes upward of 73% because those mega-rich business owners simply won't flinch. The Democrats' burning desire to raise taxes seems to confuse income and wealth. They abhor the outsized wealth accumulation of the mega-rich, even though they love the campaign contributions flowing from them. They seem to think that massive increases in income taxes will cure the growth and inequality observed over decades in the U.S. and in many foreign economies. Some of our nation's wealthiest individuals, like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, join this chorus and call for higher taxes on others, even though they channel large portions of their wealth to private foundations, revealing their preference for resources to be allocated in the private sector rather than by the government. Even our president calls for more taxes on himself, even though he could write a check to the IRS at any moment. He calls for a Buffett rule, even though he paid a tax rate of 26.3% in 2010, which, according to a recent Congressional Research Service analysis, means that the president violates his own idea of the Buffett rule by paying a lower tax rate than well over 10 million more moderate-income taxpayers. Mr. President, the past few months have witnessed a variable menu of tax rates offered by my friends on the other side of the aisle. They claim that these tax increases will secure equality, economic growth, job creation, and more. Those claims are false. The evidence is clear that the recent proposals from Democrats have been more of the same. Tax and spend, move toward a permanently larger government, and design politically motivated bills that they know will fail in the Congress in order to hone election year talking points. Mr. President, we need to be clear with the American people that these proposals might be good for government, but they will do little to cure the ills of our economy. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak up to 15 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, last Thursday marked the 5th time this year that the majority has initiated a vote on the so-called millionaire's surcharge, a tax that primarily affects small businesses, in order to pay for a piece of legislation. Notably, Thursday also marked the 5th time this year this tax increase failed to pass the Senate, which suggests, of course, that it's being used for political purposes. President Obama and his supporters have argued that the tax increases they support, like the millionaire's surcharge, will not affect anyone but the wealthiest Americans, and that those people have to start doing their fair share because they can, quote, afford it. They repeat the phrase, shared sacrifice. In a recent campaign speech in Kansas, President Obama took the class warfare argument to a whole new level, injecting his speech with false economic moralisms and invoking what he calls the you're on your own economics of Republicans, and suggesting that the breathtaking greed of a few, these are his words I'm using, has been crushing the middle class. The president's object seems to be purposefully conflating all upper-income taxpayers with those reckless few who helped cause the financial crisis, and ignoring, I might add, those in Congress who also helped to create that crisis. The president's rhetoric is not only wrong-headed, in my view, it's irresponsible, and I'd like to make 3 points in response. First, the President of the United States should not be pitting Americans against each other. Class warfare has no place in American debates. It's divisive, and it's unhelpful to national discourse. It's especially unbecoming of the President, who's the only person elected to represent all Americans. He should speak for all Americans, especially in times of high unemployment and high economic uncertainty, not pit them one against each other for short-term political gain. America is not a caste society. There's no formal class structure ingrained into our way of life. The opposite is true. That's why millions of people left the old countries in Europe and elsewhere to come here for economic opportunity and compete in our free markets. Why doesn't the President offer encouragement about America's strengths and its future, rather than play into some Americans' fears? In other words, why doesn't he run the kind of campaign that he ran in 2008, one based on unity and hope? The answer, I'm afraid, is because the President's record during the last 3 years doesn't inspire much hope. A massive stimulus filled with special interest goodies, a government takeover of health care, a failed cap-and-trade agenda, and an EPA power grab, and more new job-killing regulations than one can count. Obviously, the policies of the last 3 years have not left Americans in better shape than they were 3 years ago. Indeed, about three-quarters of Americans say the country is on the wrong track. As columnist Charles Krauthammer wrote in a recent column, and I quote, "Obama has spent 3 years on signature policies that ignore or aggravate," end of quote, "structural problems such as high unemployment, weak growth, vast debt, and our strained safety net and dysfunctional tax code." So the President can't run on his record, and he doesn't want voters to focus on how his policies may have prolonged our economic troubles or that his party controlled Washington for the first 2 years of his presidency. His way out is to blame others. But rather than stir up resentment and unease, I suggest the President focus on strengthening opportunity for all Americans. And that gets to the second point, which addresses the assertion that upper-income taxpayers aren't doing their fair share. This is patently false. Let me provide a few instructive numbers. According to IRS data, the top 1% of taxpayers pay 38% of total income taxes but earn only 20% of total income. In other words, the top 1% earns 20% and pays almost double that in their share of federal income taxes. The top 2% of taxpayers pay almost half of all the taxes, 48.68% to be example. It only earns a little under 28% of the total income and pays almost 50%. So the top 2% paying almost 50% of all the taxes. And this isn't a fair share. This isn't doing their part. The top 5% of taxpayers pay 58.7%. They earn just a little over one-third of all of the income. And in fact, the top 5% pay more than the top 90 or bottom 95% total. The top 5% pay more taxes by far than the rest of the 95%. And they're not doing their fair share. The top 10% of taxpayers pay almost 70% and still earn less than 50% of total income, 45.7% to be exact. The bottom 95% of taxpayers pay 41.3%. They earn 65.3% of total income. So the bottom 95%, this is a big chunk of American taxpayers, are earning a lot more in percentage than they're paying in percentage of income taxes. The Joint Committee on Taxation estimates that 51% of all households, which includes both filers and non-filers, had either zero or negative income tax liability for the year 2009. Such progressive taxation is, in fact, shared sacrifice. The United States has the most progressive income tax code of any country among developed nations. So the argument that top-tier earners aren't doing enough just doesn't hold water. And somebody needs to call the President on this false argument of his, because it attempts to pit one group of Americans against the other, when in point of fact, the President of all people should be unifying Americans. The third point is related to who actually would pay this millionaire surcharge that the President advocates and that our colleagues have been urging us to vote for yet again. This proposed tax increase will presumably be trotted out again and again. It can't get the votes to pass, but it makes a nice political charge. The President and his supporters claim it would only affect the wealthiest of the wealthy. Well, the fact is this tax would crush small business owners. Many small businesses are organized as pass-through entities. That means that they pay their taxes as individuals. They are not organized as corporations. They don't pay their taxes as corporations. They pay as individuals. So when the plumbing company or the air conditioning company pays taxes, that small business owner pays them as an individual. And therefore he pays at the individual income tax rates. If you're in one of the top two rates, and 50% of small business income is reported in those top two rates, you're going to get clobbered by this surtax on millionaires. And these are the very businesses, the most successful small businesses, that create many of America's new jobs. According to the National Association of Manufacturers' December 5th weekly report, I'm quoting, small and medium-sized payrolls, those with less than 500 employees, accounted for the bulk of the net new jobs, continuing a familiar trend. This was true for both the goods-producing as well as the service-producing sectors, end of quote. There's a lot of data that show that many of these job-creating small businesses would be slammed by a millionaire surcharge. For example, Wall Street Journal editorial reports that the Joint Committee on Taxation has estimated that taxpayers will declare $1.2 trillion in business income in 2013. Of this reported tax income, 34% would be on returns with modified adjusted gross income in excess of $1 million. As the Journal notes, that means that about $400 billion in business income would be subjected to the so-called millionaire's surcharge tax. And who pays that? As the Journal writes, the Treasury Department examined IRS data in 2007, found that 392,000 tax returns with income above $1 million, 311 million of which were classified by the Treasury Department as business owners. So, 80% of a payroll tax surcharge will fall on these small business owners. That is a direct tax on job creation. What could you think of that would do more harm to creating jobs in America than imposing a brand new tax right on the people who are, we hope, going to create the new jobs coming out of this recession? And remember, too, that taxes were already set up to go in 2013 when the current tax rates expire. And on top of that, business investors will also face a 3.8% Obamacare investment income tax surcharge set to begin in 2013. How is taking money away from these small businesses going to allow them to expand and hire more workers? John Mackey, who's co-founder of the wildly successful Whole Foods chain, wrote an op-ed last month explaining, from his point of view, what policies can help and harm job growth. And he writes, I quote, 100 years ago, the total cost of government at all levels was only 8% of our gross domestic product. In 2010, it was 40%. Government is gobbling up trillions of dollars from our economy to feed itself through higher taxes and unprecedented deficit spending, money that could be used by individuals to improve their lives and by entrepreneurs to create jobs, end of quote. So, Mr. President, policymakers would do well to listen to the advice of entrepreneurs like John Mackey about a real growth agenda. Americans are counting on job creators in the private sector to help turn the economy around by putting capital at risk and hiring new employees. Relentless class warfare and obsessing over income redistribution are not real policy prescriptions. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record at the conclusion of my remarks the op-ed piece by Charles Krauthammer to which I mentioned.
Without objection.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
I want to speak about the vote that we're going to have this afternoon, and it has nothing to do with Mr. Eisen's job as ambassador. It's about why he hasn't been confirmed to this point. The President announced Mr. Eisen's nomination to be ambassador to the Czech Republic.
Mr. President, could I ask of the chair?
The Senator from Massachusetts.
I apologize for interrupting my colleague, and I won't for long, but I think my colleague wants to speak on the subject of the nominations that are going to be contained within an hour of debate equally divided. And so I want to make certain that the comments of the Senator are going to be part of that time period. So if I could ask for my colleague, I believe we're almost at the hour where we have to go to executive session, report the two nominations. Then I'd be happy to yield to my colleague to speak first if he would like. Would my colleague agree with that?
Senator from Iowa.
I'm willing to do that, but I thought I maintained the right to the floor by...
Mr. President, I will, the Senator will, I ask unanimous consent that after we've moved to executive session, the Senator from Iowa be the first to speak on the time period allotted to the Republican, to the opponents.
Yeah.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations en bloc, which the clerk will report.
Nominations: Department of State, Norman L. Eisen of the District of Columbia to be Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the United States of America to the Czech Republic. Mary Carmen Aponte of the District of Columbia to be Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the United States of America to the Republic of El Salvador.
Under the previous order, there will be 1 hour of debate equally divided in the usual form.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
The President announced Mr. Eisen's nomination to be Ambassador to the Czech Republic on June 28, 2010. On September the 20th, 2010, I provided public notice of my intention to object to the nomination. In other words, as I always do when I put a hold on something, a bill or a nomination, I put a reason in the congressional record so that everybody knows that it's me. I'm not a secret holds guy. The reason for my objection is not related to the substance of his duty as ambassador. I objected to his nomination because of the way Mr. Eisen handled the controversial firing of Gerald Walpin and the congressional inquiry into that firing. Mr. Walpin was the Inspector General at the Corporation for National and Community Services, AmeriCorps. Mr. Eisen was at the White House Counsel's Office at the time. Any attempt to undermine the independence and integrity of Inspectors General raises serious concerns with me, and anybody ought to know that about this senator. An Inspector General that does his or her job runs the risk of losing friends at any agency, as well as maybe the White House. The Congress must not sit idly by when an Inspector General is removed improperly. After the President abruptly removed Inspector General Walpin from office, there were allegations that he was fired for political reasons, so I started an investigation. There was evidence that the removal may have been motivated by the desire to protect a friend and political ally of the President, Sacramento Mayor Kevin Johnson. The Inspector General and the CNCS management were clashing over an inquiry into misuse of federal grant money at a charity run by Johnson. There were allegations that the grant money was used to pay for personal services for Johnson, such as maybe washing his car. There seemed to be evidence of that. There were allegations that the grant money had been used for political campaign work. So what would you expect an Inspector General to do? The IG was pushing aggressively to require Johnson to repay the federal grant money that his charity could not account for. The Inspector General was also pushing to have Johnson prohibited from receiving future federal grant funds. This caused, as you might expect, a political uproar because some people feared that might prevent the city of Sacramento from receiving federal stimulus dollars during the financial crisis. All of this background cried out for further investigation. I also learned that Mr. Eisen personally delivered an ultimatum to Inspector General Walpin. He demanded the Inspector General resign or be terminated within 1 hour. At the time he delivered the ultimatum, no notice had been given or provided to Congress, as is legally required under the Inspector General Reform Act. The IG Act requires the President to tell Congress the reasons for removal of an Inspector General 30 days before taking action. That's what the law requires. Now, ironically, I co-sponsored this provision with Senator Obama before he became President Obama. The goal of that provision is to make sure that Congress is aware of why an Inspector General is being removed.
We need independent inspectors general. They should not be removed for political reasons, so we need to make sure Congress is informed of the reasons for getting rid of an inspector general. Mr. Eisen's one-hour ultimatum was an attempt to avoid that provision of law. If the inspector general had resigned under that pressure, Congress would not have received any notice, and the reasons for his removal would have remained a secret. But Inspector General Walton didn't resign, and the President began process of removing him with the 30-day notice. At first, the notice merely said he had lost confidence in the Inspector General. Senators from both political parties agreed that that was too vague. So Mr. Eisen provided a second, more detailed explanation. The second explanation said that the Inspector General had been, quote, unquote, confused and disoriented at a board meeting on May the 20th, 2009. It essentially implied that he might be senile. So my staff met with Mr. Eisen to try to learn more. So here I give you another reason for my hold on Mr. Eisen. During that interview with the congressional staff on June the 17th, 2009, Mr. Eisen refused to answer at least 12 very direct questions. I wrote to the White House counsel's office immediately after the interview. I listed the 12 questions he refused to answer and asked for written answers. I never got a satisfactory reply, so I had to gather the facts independently. So Mr. Eisen did provide some information during this interview that very day in 2009. The problem is the information turned out to be not true. Eisen tried to assure the staff that the firing was not politically motivated. He claimed that the agency's bipartisan board of directors unanimously supported the removal of the Inspector General Walton before the President decided to remove him. He also claimed that the White House conducted, quote, unquote, an extensive review in response to concerns raised by the board about Walton's fitness for that office. He said this review was prompted by that incident of May 20th, 2009 board meeting where it appeared that the Inspector General was disoriented. When congressional investigators interviewed eyewitnesses, however, their accounts differed slightly. At a minimum, all agreed that the Inspector General lost his train of thought during the presentation. Others described it as being a more serious episode. The chairman of the board of directors suggested telling the White House about what happened. No one on the board objected. So he went and met with Mr. Eisen in the White House counsel's office. Now think about that, would you please? If you think the Inspector General might be suffering from some mental incapacity or illness, why would you run straight to the White House counsel's office? It seemed to me you would talk to his family or the people who worked with him every day about your concerns. That would be the only way to find out if there had been similar incidents or if it was a one-time occurrence. Instead, the chairman of the board asked Mr. Eisen at the White House counsel's office to look into it. According to Mr. Eisen, he conducted, quote, unquote, an extensive review, which then formed the basis for the President's decision to remove Walton from office. However, our investigation finds no evidence that Mr. Eisen review consisted of anything more than simply asking the CNCS management to describe their complaints about Mr. Walton. Unlike the congressional review, Mr. Eisen did not interview each of the board members present at the May 20th meeting. He also did not interview the other Office of Inspector General employee who was present with Mr. Walton during that board meeting where they said he was disoriented. Instead, Eisen merely collected from the agency details about various routine disagreements with the Inspector General. Now get this, none of the evidence the agency provided to the White House related to Mr. Walton's mental capacity to serve, even though that was the question that supposedly prompted the review in the first place. Mr. Eisen accepted the agency's version of those disagreements without even giving the Inspector General a chance to respond. Obviously, any agency is going to have some clashes with an Inspector General, at least if that office operates as a truly independent and aggressive watchdog. Mr. Eisen did not provide Mr. Walpin or anyone else in the Office of Inspector General an opportunity to reply or give their side of the story. Mr. Eisen took action based upon incomplete information provided only by agency officials who had adversarial relationships with that Inspector General. He told Congress that the May 20th incident was the reason for moving the Inspector General. But Mr. Eisen failed to give Inspector General Walpin or anyone close to him a chance to tell his side of the story. To put it as simply as possible, that's just not fair. On June the 17th, 2009, I wrote to White House Counsel Gregory Craig, listing 12 specific direct questions that Eisen refused to answer that day. Question 4 was this, quote, which witnesses were interviewed in the course of Mr. Eisen's review? End of quote. End of the question. This question followed a more general question about what Mr. Eisen did in the course of his review. His answer to that prior, more general question included the claim that he conducted witness interviews of the board members. However, he refused to specify which witnesses or how many witnesses he interviewed. Then he resorted to talking points rather than answering specific questions. He replied along these lines. 1, we did an extensive review. 2, I'm not going to get into the details. And 3, all of the board members agreed, including the Republican board members. Mr. Eisen clearly led the staff to believe that the President's decision was based in part on the unanimous agreement of the board that the Inspector General should go. That was false. The account of Eisen's interview is based on memories of both House and Senate staff present at that time. Also present was a career law enforcement agency from the executive branch on temporary detail to my oversight and investigation staff, whose recollections confirmed this account as well. In short, Mr. Eisen's lack of candor and cooperation cannot be mistaken for a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. There was no miscommunication. Attempts to remove an IG must be evaluated with strict scrutiny. When administration officials are asked to provide information to Congress, I expect and rely on those officials to provide the unvarnished truth. Evidence that a witness may have misled Congress is extremely serious. Just last month, Mr. Eisen finally admitted to his earlier statements were not true. He sent me a letter that I have here, and I'm asked permission to put it in the record. He sent me a letter on November the 20th this year admitting his answers were quote-unquote inaccurate. He also acknowledged in a meeting with me that the key factual findings in the staff report were correct. He said he did not intentionally provide false information, and he has apologized. I'm sure he sincerely regrets the way that he handled the questions, especially since it has led to the difficulty in his confirmation process. And probably if we had had that letter as we asked for late last year, he would have been confirmed at that particular time. Now, after my meeting with him this year, I accepted his apology about the false or quote-unquote inaccurate statements, and I agreed to proceed to the nomination with the 60-vote margin required for confirmation. Now, the majority leader didn't agree with that, so he decided to invoke cloture instead. So I will oppose cloture because I am still opposed to the confirmation. My opposition was always based on more than just 1 or 2 false statements. Lack of candor is broader than whether a particular statement is technically true. It includes his failure to be forthcoming and responsive to those questions that were asked on June the 17th, 2009. His evasiveness caused House and Senate staff to spend much more time and resources uncovering the truth. If he had just answered a few simple, factual questions, that wouldn't have been necessary. For example, in relation to the one-hour ultimatum, he refused to answer specific questions about his June 10th, 2009 conversation with Mr. Walpin. He would only say that he disagreed with certain aspects of Mr. Walpin's account without specifying which aspects. Word games and evasiveness of that sort are incompatible with being a candid and forthcoming witness and ought to be incompatible with a person representing the United States as an ambassador. My reasons for opposing his nomination also include all of the other circumstances surrounding the way that Mr. Eisen handled Mr. Walpin's removal. Mr. Eisen, his attempt to force the Inspector General to resign with a one-hour ultimatum would have amounted to a constructive removal. He would have evaded the congressional notice requirement if had been successful. However, Inspector General Walpin refused to resign and even filed lawsuit to try to keep his position. He did not win his lawsuit because ultimately the White House did comply with the technical requirements of the 30-day notice provision. After the controversy erupted, the Inspector General was placed on administrative leave until 30 days after the second, more detailed notice to Congress. That is why Walpin lost his lawsuit, but that does not change the nature and the fact that Norm Eisen attempted to evade the statute. He tried to force a quiet resignation and thus remove the Inspector General from office without the 30-day notice to Congress that the law requires. Because Inspector General Walpin did not yield to the pressure, no court had a chance to rule on whether that would be appropriate. I'm also opposed to this nomination because of the way the White House decided to avoid these issues last year with a recess appointment. The Senate confirmation under the advice and consent clause is one of the strongest checks on the executive branch power. Recess appointments are meant to fill vacancies that arise during a long recess, not to bypass the confirmation process. This vacancy arose on January the 20th, 2009, yet the President waited 18 months before making an appointment. There had already been a lot of controversy over Mr. Eisen's actions at the time of his appointment. The White House should have known that there would be issues with his confirmation. Rather than listening to my concerns, the White House decided to bypass Congress. President Obama rewarded Mr. Eisen by using a recess appointment to install him as acting U.S. ambassador to the Czech Republic. Mr. Eisen has had several opportunities to address my concerns last year. He was scheduled to meet with my staff on December the 16th, 2010 at 11:30 a.m. At approximately 11:15 a.m., the White House postponed the meeting until 2:15 p.m. At approximately 2 o'clock, the meeting was canceled by the White House Office of Legislative Affairs without further explanation. By calling off a face-to-face meeting in favor of a recess appointment, the White House sent the message that the President is not interested in hearing the concerns of Republican members of Congress. Once he had his recess appointment, Mr. Eisen did not seek to meet with me or my staff again until that appointment was about to expire at the end of this year. Only then did he apologize and admit that the statements in his staff interview were not accurate. Now remember, our President, at the time of his inauguration, made a commitment to be the most transparent of any administration in our history. So, in summary, Mr. Eisen took action on behalf of the President that ran afoul of the Inspector General Reform Act. Mr. Eisen only listened to the agency's complaints about the Inspector General rather than conducting a fair, thorough, and responsible investigation. And then he misled congressional investigators about his review and about the true basis of the President's decision to fire the Inspector General. He admitted in this letter to me that he provided inaccurate information but claimed that it was unintentional. This is the second time in the last 2 months that an official from this administration has done that. The Deputy Attorney General just withdrew a letter sent to me on Operation Fast and Furious earlier this year because of its quote-unquote inaccuracies. I'm afraid there is a pattern developing here in this administration about not being leveling with Congress in its constitutional responsibility of oversight. When we ask for information from the executive branch, I expect, and I think I can speak for 100 senators, we expect honest, forthcoming, and truthful answers. We can disagree on policy. We're all entitled to our opinion, but we're not entitled to our own facts. Getting the facts straight should not be like pulling teeth. We need to send a signal that congressional oversight matters. We need to send a signal that there are consequences in misleading Congress. It should come as no surprise to anybody it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that doing our constitutional job of oversight is very important to this senator. I know that Ambassador Eisen recognizes that. I got that very clearly from him in our last meeting in October. I don't like interference with people in either a Republican or Democrat administration that don't cooperate with my investigations, and I'll bet you every senator would say that. Therefore, for the reasons I just gave, I ask my colleagues to oppose cloture and oppose this nomination. I yield the floor. I'm on this side.
Without objection, the senator from Massachusetts.
I think I'd like to have you use the floor.
Mr. President, I'm momentarily going to yield time to the senator from New Jersey, but before I do, I just want to say very quickly, I'm not going to make all of my comments right now, but I'd say to my colleague from Iowa, first of all, I have great respect for his diligent approach to these issues, and he has been tremendously receptive to a continuing dialogue on this. I want to express my gratitude to him for that. When asked, he met with Ambassador Eisen, and he has certainly listened to the facts as they were presented by others who had a different point of view about them. And obviously every senator here always does draw their own conclusions. But I think I first of all want to thank Senator Grassley for his willingness to agree to have these votes that we will have today and to move forward with some resolution with respect to this. I understand he has chosen to oppose the nominee. I would simply say to him, and I think to others, sometimes in these processes, sometimes in the questions for the record, as we call them, where people provide written questions, and even in the interviews, there are miscommunications, misinterpretations, misstatements that are not intentional and not meant to somehow mislead or deceive somebody. I would simply say to the senator, I know that he has met with Ambassador Eisen, and we've now heard why he intends to vote no on this. But let me just say that I am convinced that several different individuals and entities have thoroughly investigated and examined the removal of the Inspector General Walpin, and they have found that there was no wrongdoing. The Foreign Relations Committee looked into it in conjunction with the consideration of his nomination, and the Homeland Security Committee examined this issue. It was, in fact, litigated in federal district court and before the D.C. Circuit. None of these entities, not one of them, found that either the President somehow acted wrongly or illegally or inappropriately in connection with the removal of Mr. Walpin from office, and to the contrary, the U.S. District Court specifically rejected Mr. Walpin's claims that he was improperly removed from this position, and they dismissed his lawsuit. Our friends, Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins, both of whom enjoy strong reputations for both independence and integrity within the Senate, stated their belief as ranking and chair of the Homeland Security that the President met the letter and spirit of the Inspector General Reform Act. And I do believe there was some miscommunication. I've talked to the Senator from Iowa about it. I think it was unfortunate. I wish it had been cleared up earlier. But I believe that it was genuinely a miscommunication, not an intentional act. I appreciate the fact that Mr. Eisen has apologized to Senator Grassley for his sense of that miscommunication, a difference between review and removal and a sense of what may have happened in the course of that. But I also appreciate Senator Grassley's willingness to look beyond that and to enforce his principles as he is privileged to do as an individual senator, but also to allow the Senate to try to do its work here today. I will say a few words about Mr. Eisen and the job that he is doing, an outstanding job in Prague on our behalf. But first, the Senator from New Jersey is here to speak about a different nominee. And so, Mr. President, I would yield up to 10 minutes to the Senator from New Jersey.
President.
The Senator from New Jersey.
I thank the distinguished chairman for yielding. And I've come to the floor to address the nomination of an extraordinary woman, a qualified, talented Latina, to be the United States ambassador to El Salvador. Now, unfortunately, some of my Republican colleagues have made Ambassador Carmen Aponte a target of inside-the-Beltway politics, where the political points gained from bringing down an administration nominee supersede the value gained from having a superior ambassador promoting and guarding American interests at a critical time. Born in Puerto Rico, Ambassador Aponte became the executive director of the Puerto Rican Federal Affairs Administration in 2001. She served as director of the National Council of La Raza and the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. She has presided over the Hispanic Bar Association of the District of Columbia and the Hispanic National Bar Association. She has excelled in her field. She's won the respect of her colleagues and the diplomatic community. So let's look at the record. Nearly 2 years ago, I chaired the nomination hearing for Ambassador Aponte to serve as President Obama's ambassador in San Salvador. At that time, one of my Republican colleagues objected to her nomination because he was not given access to her FBI file to review information about a personal relationship Ambassador Aponte had with a Cuban national some 20 years ago. Pursuant to precedent, one Democrat and one Republican reviewed that file. I was a Democrat, and there was nothing in the file to substantiate the concerns raised by my colleagues. On this issue, I take a backseat to no one when it comes to promoting democracy in Cuba and opposing the Castro regime or anyone who sympathizes with a despotic regime. And I certainly would never for a moment let down my guard when it comes to that regime. And I can assure every one of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, if I had any concern about Ambassador Aponte and that she had been somehow her relationship with that Cuban national, or if there was any relationship with the Castro regime in her background, I would not be supporting her today. But, Mr. President, this is a respected American diplomat who has been on the job and served this nation with distinction. In the 15 months since Ambassador Aponte was sworn in as the U.S. ambassador to El Salvador during a recess appointment, she has impressed the diplomatic establishment with her professionalism, won the respect of parties, both right and left in El Salvador. She has won the respect of civilian and military forces. She has won the respect of the public and private sector. She has won everyone's support and fostered a strong U.S. Salvadorian bilateral relationship that culminated when President Obama announced El Salvador as only one of 4 countries in the world and the only country in Latin America chosen to participate in the Partnership for Growth initiative. Most importantly, Ambassador Aponte has been an advocate for American national security and democratic values. As a result of her advocacy, El Salvador is again a key ally in Central America, and its troops are the only one from a Latin American country fighting alongside American troops in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Ambassador Aponte has consistently fought efforts by Cuba and Venezuela to gain influence in Central America. And as a result of her negotiating skills, the United States and El Salvador will open a new joint electronic monitoring center, jointly funded, by the way, that will be an invaluable tool in fighting transnational crime. This is a record of success. It is a record of honor. It is a record of diplomatic and political distinction. It's the record of a dedicated, qualified, experienced, and engaged American diplomat, a 15-month American diplomat, a 15-month record that brought our nations together and pursued our interests. What more could we ask? What more should we ask? So having said that, because of my strong belief that Ambassador Aponte is fully and uniquely qualified for this post, during the last several months I worked with the distinguished chairman, Senator Kerry, to find a way, despite committee precedent, to allow additional Republicans on the Foreign Relations Committee to review the ambassador's FBI file. As a result, not one but two Republicans, my colleague and friend from Florida, Mr. Rubio, and the senator from South Carolina, Mr. DeMint, were able to review her file. Since the concern had been not having access to the file, we presumed that once they were reviewed, they would lift their objections and allow a vote on her nomination. Why? Because there is nothing in that file that would indicate otherwise. But we were wrong. It wasn't about the file. That appeared to just be a delay tactic. The opposition to Ms. Aponte's nomination turned out to be about one thing and one thing only, and that's politics. Our good faith effort to provide full access to information and address concerns about Ms. Aponte was summarily dismissed. At our nomination hearing in November, Republican members of the committee raised a new concern, an editorial penned by Ambassador Aponte on tolerance and nonviolence during Gay Pride Month in June. Republicans decried it as disregarding Salvadorian culture and questioned her motives for writing the editorial, despite the fact that the editorial was a result of a cable edict to all embassies from the State Department urging missions to write editorials during these events. The true irony of this trumped-up allegation is that the editorial, which Republicans assert, quote, stirred controversy and was rebuked throughout Latin America, mirrored a May 2010 decree by Salvadorian President Funes prohibiting discrimination by the government of El Salvador based on sexual orientation. So let's be honest. There's no question about Ambassador Aponte's qualifications or performance on the job or about whether an editorial on tolerance is grounds for sacking an ambassador. This is just another Republican dog and pony show to undermine the President's policy objectives and attack a qualified Democratic nominee to an essential post. When the facts, when the files, when there is nothing that corroborated the vicious allegations about Ms. Aponte's past, those on the other side argued that her editorial on the elimination of prejudice was the basis for their opposition. When they learned that the government of El Salvador itself supports this view, Republicans again changed their tune. 4 weeks after her November 29th nomination hearing, on the eve of the Foreign Relations Business Committee meeting, these members decided they wanted to attack from a different angle. They called for a new classified hearing to vet her nomination, to permit questions to FBI and diplomatic security investigators about whether they had been subjected to political interference for determining Ambassador Aponte's eligibility for a security clearance. I find it pretty appalling that members of the chamber would essentially suggest, without evidence, that professional FBI and diplomatic security members would bend to political pressure, or that any administration would apply such pressure, risking U.S. national security on behalf of any person. Those members knew the content and timing of their request would make it impossible to fulfill. And to his credit, the chairman of the committee, Senator Kerry, over the last several weeks has nonetheless sought to resolve the situation, and in fact there has been an offer made to Senator DeMint to go over the whole essence of the background of the diplomatic security clearance. Mr. President, the shifting basis of the opposition to Ambassador Aponte reveals, to me at least, that the motive for this opposition is pure partisan politics, driven by pure partisan interests, fueled by pure partisan desire to disrail an administration nominee for the sake of derailment alone, without any regard to the consequences for American foreign policy or for the nation. I have seen this ambassador. She has succeeded beyond anybody's wildest expectations in a country that has dramatically turned the course of events in a way we want to see it. I urge my colleagues to support Ambassador Aponte's nomination. I urge them to put partisan politics aside, recognize the benefits to America's security and foreign policy interests that her tenure has delivered, and allow Ambassador Aponte to continue serving our nation. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and yield back to the chairman any time I may not have consumed.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to express my opposition to the nomination of Marie Carmen Aponte to be ambassador to El Salvador. Her confirmation has been unanimously opposed twice by all Republicans on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and for good reason. But before I discuss Ms. Aponte, I'd like to clarify some facts about the nomination process. Several Democrats have voiced complaints recently about Senate Republicans' supposed obstruction when it comes to President Obama's nominees. But most of his nominees have not even been contested. In fact, since Obama has been president, the Senate has confirmed 1,198 of his nominees. Only a small fraction of these nominees have been so controversial that they have been blocked by the Senate. As a member of the Senate, I take the Senate's constitutional duty to provide advice and consent to the President's nominees seriously. While the overwhelming majority of nominees are easily confirmed, some do rise to such a level that further debate and scrutiny are required by the U.S. Senate. Ms. Aponte is one of these nominees. This is not the first time the Senate has considered confirming Ms. Aponte for an ambassadorship. She was first nominated by former President Clinton in 1998 to be the ambassador to the Dominican Republic. At the time, Senator Jesse Helms, who was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, learned of possible background issues and concerns by investigators relating to Ms. Aponte's ties to Cuban intelligence. Primarily, the questions centered around the 12-year romantic relationship she had with a man who was targeted as part of an FBI counterintelligence investigation and allegedly worked for Cuba's spy agency. A high-ranking Cuban defector claimed that Cuban intelligence tried to recruit Ms. Aponte to be a spy for the Cuban government. Rather than discuss her past relationship, Ms. Aponte withdrew her nomination and it was filled by someone else. Eventually, Ms. Aponte was given a top security clearance by the State Department, despite what some have described serious objections from career officials. When President Obama nominated Ms. Aponte in March of 2010 to be ambassador to El Salvador, Republicans asked for more information to address the allegations that had previously surfaced, namely, information about the scope of the 1998 investigation, including an update to that file. Second, information about the Cuban defector that was handled by the CEA, who publicly alleged that Cuban intelligence had attempted to recruit Ms. Aponte through her longtime live-in boyfriend. And three, information about the FBI's counterintelligence investigation that led to Ms. Aponte's refusal to take a lie detector test in 1994 as requested by the FBI. Serious questions, honest questions. Instead of allowing senators to access that information and alleviate our concerns, President Obama went around the Senate and granted Ms. Aponte a recess appointment in August of 2010. For nearly a year and a half, Republicans have been continually denied access to Ms. Aponte's full FBI record and other information as the Obama administration has rebuffed our requests related to Ms. Aponte's past. Shortly after Ms. Aponte was first nominated by President Obama, I, along with 4 other members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, wrote a letter to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to ask for her assistance in obtaining this information. That same month, all 8 Republican members of the committee wrote to Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman John Kerry stating that committee members had not received requested information needed to fully vet the nominee. Let me remind everyone, we never received that information. Ms. Aponte was recess appointed by the Obama administration later that summer. We have continued our efforts to work with the administration to get access to this information. Chairman Kerry was able to convince the White House to allow me to see a summary of the diplomatic security background investigation. However, that summary did not address the fundamental questions that have arisen, and that summary left me with more questions than answers. So committee Republicans wrote another letter to Chairman Kerry about our concerns last month. In the letter we said, and I quote, "We recognize the need to balance highly sensitive materials during the confirmation process. However, we believe that in this particular case, the scope of the background review was not appropriately complete." We went on to say, and I quote, "The background summary that was provided was based on an updated investigation, but it did not encompass numerous allegations that the initial background investigation in 1998 was tainted by political interference. News reports and other sources allege that Ms. Aponte received security clearance despite objections from career officials due to outside pressure. However, these allegations and the circumstances surrounding them were not part of the current background investigation. Without additional information, senators had no way of determining the validity of media stories and rumors that had been circulating about this nominee's past. We also asked for a closed hearing due to these lingering issues. We wrote, and I quote, "We believe that the circumstances warrant additional committee review in the form of a closed hearing. A closed hearing would allow senators to review and discuss the classified and sensitive data relevant to the nomination and discuss the unresolved issues with investigators and relevant intelligence community officials. As the issue involved both a high-ranking Cuban defector and FBI counterintelligence investigations, a closed hearings would be the most beneficial format available to the committee to rectify the deficiency of information provided." Senator Kerry declined to hold a closed briefing and wrote a letter back that said, "In my view, the process we have followed with regard to Ms. Aponte's nomination has afforded committee members ample time and opportunity to consider her nomination and secure answers to any relevant questions." He also said we should all be in a position now to debate Ms. Aponte's nomination on its merits. Senator Kerry then offered to work with my office further to get answers from the administration. I believe he did work in good faith with our office, but in the end, the White House once again denied our request for information. While I agree with Senator Kerry that there has been ample time spent on Ms. Aponte's nomination, we still lack critical information. The Senate cannot, in good faith, confirm a nominee who has repeatedly refused to answer simple, necessary questions related to her past. In addition to questions about her past, Ms. Aponte's current judgment is also in question. In her recess-appointed capacity as ambassador to El Salvador, Ms. Aponte has inflamed tensions in the very country where she should be improving diplomatic relations. Her decision to publish an opinion piece hostile to the culture of El Salvadorians present even more doubts about her fitness for the job. This op-ed upset a large number of community and pro-life groups in El Salvador who were insulted by Ms. Aponte's rhetoric. A coalition of more than 36 groups have since written the Senate asking its members to oppose Ms. Aponte's confirmation. I quote from their letter in which they wrote, "We respectfully request that Ms. Aponte be removed from post as soon as possible so that El Salvador may enjoy the benefits of having a person as a government representative of your noble country." Meanwhile, Republicans on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee are still trying to get access to information about Ms. Aponte's past. 2 days ago, the White House again denied senators the right to be briefed or review information relevant to this nomination. Senators should not be forced to vote on a nominee without a complete understanding of her background. We urge you to join us and vote against cloture. Thank you, Mr. President, and reserve the balance of Republican time. And how much time is left?
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
That's pretty good timing. Thank you. I yield back.
President, I yield 4 minutes to the Senator from Connecticut.
The Senator from Connecticut.
I thank the Chair and thank my friend from Massachusetts. Mr. President, I rise to speak in support of the nomination of Norm Eisen to be ambassador to the Czech Republic. I've known Norm in a very personal capacity, so I feel very strongly about this nomination. Since I was fortunate enough to be elected to the U.S. Senate, came to Washington in the late 80s. I joined a synagogue in Georgetown, and Norm Eisen and his wife and children are members of that synagogue, so I've gotten to know them in a totally non-political, non-diplomatic way, and based on that, I start with a real appreciation of this as a fine, honorable, public-spirited man. He happened to have gone to law school with President Obama. And I think as a result of that, the President knew him, asked him to be the ethics counsel in the White House in the first years of the administration. I think anybody you talk to about his, or most anybody you talk to about his performance in that job would say that he did an excellent job. He was demanding ethically and intellectually. His honor and his quest to have the government and those who serve in government act in an honorable way is very high. When there was a vacancy in the position of ambassador to the Czech Republic, President Obama asked Norm Eisen if he would serve. And the President did something that really had a lot of meaning to it, apart from Norman's quite considerable resume, private attorney, successful, highly regarded, very effective. Norm Eisen is the child of survivors of the Holocaust. His mother was actually born in the Czech Republic. So what a remarkable moment for President Obama to ask him to return to the country from which his family was essentially chased, and some worse, as the ambassador of the greatest country in the world, the superpower, the United States of America. In that position as ambassador, so now we have a record that he's got. Before he got, there was this problem about the nomination raised by Senator Grassley at that time, and so he has a recess appointment. But now he's been there, and he's done an extraordinary job. I know from conversations with people in Prague that he is very, very highly regarded by the leadership of the Czech Republic. An extraordinary bipartisan group of foreign policy experts have endorsed his confirmation. It would actually be extremely disruptive if we did not confirm Norm Eisen in terms of our relations, diplomatic, economic, security relations with the Czech Republic, which are so important. So I think if you were considering this nomination and put the various arguments on the scales of justice, on one side you have a record of public service, of honor, of great family values, of intellectual excellence, of belief in public service, of a great record now in the time he's been in Prague as our ambassador. On the other side, you have a question about how Norman, while he was in the White House as ethics counsel, handled the case of this one individual, Inspector General at the Corporation for National and Community Service. I've been over this in great detail. You know, in our governmental affairs part of the Homeland Security Committee, we oversee the IGs. Senator Collins and I have gone over this, and we simply, with respect to Senator Grassley, who's been very thorough and fair about this and is probably the leading protector and defender of the IGs in the Senate, in the matter that bothers him, there was a misunderstanding. There was not, in my opinion, after looking at this very thoroughly, an intentional act of deceit. There was a misunderstanding, and Ambassador Eisen has now apologized for that misunderstanding, stating unintentionally an inaccuracy. So on one side of the scales of justice, you have all these extraordinary positives, and on the other, a question raised about this one case that he handled which some say, Senator Grassley and others working for him say was deceitful. Ambassador Eisen says it was a misunderstanding for which he apologizes. To me, it is not only in the interest of the United States, but also in the interest of fairness and justice with which we like to believe we conduct our proceedings here, that the Senate today, across party lines, confirmed the nomination of Norm Eisen to be ambassador to the Czech Republic. I thank the chair and yield the floor.